We're trying something a little different with this camera review. Motorola is releasing two new flagship phones, the Moto Z and the Z Force, and unlike some other manufacturers, there actually is a difference in camera tech between these two. So we're going to pit them against each other in a friendly competition of stablemates. Buckle up, folks, we have a lot of ground to cover, and I'm gonna move pretty quick. First, a little housekeeping. The Moto Z features a 13-megapixel shooter with optical image stabilization, laser-assisted focus, and an f1.8 aperture. The Moto Z Force increases the resolution to 21 megapixels and adds phase detection to the focusing system. We're unsure exactly what size these sensors are, but both have 1.12 micron pixels, and eagle-eyed viewers have already commented on our other videos that the Force camera has a larger lens than the Z. The apps between the two are identical. We see similar performance in terms of image processing, and we'll note in the bottom left corner which phone produced which images. Before jumping into samples, we should point out that this review was produced on pre-release software, and we encountered a fair number of gremlins in this camera app, the worst in low-light situations. Though we expect this should be addressed in an update once the phone is actually available for purchase. Now, starting off with exposure and saturation, like most phones, these two are trying to produce bright and vivid images with eye-pleasing color, and there isn't a tremendous difference in how these two expose, meter, and finish off a JPEG. Blues and greens look vibrant, and we mostly avoid that hyper-teal band of sky near the horizon. Browns and earth tones maybe feel a bit dull or muted. We don't want rust to become orange, but the dead grass here is starting to become gray. Yellows are well captured. The camera's natural inclination is to clip brighter and warmer colors, but we're keeping a fair amount of petal detail here. Reds are always tough for digital sensors to produce accurately, and the Moto falls for the same trap many others trip over in overexposing and oversaturating. These are two different colors of bougainvillea blossoms, one bush more red, one more pink, but pretty much everything here is a sizzling magenta. This is super common for phone cameras, but the Moto lacks any raw capture we can find to give you better files to edit from. Lastly, white objects in direct sun are really tricky to meter for properly, but I was happy to see decent dynamic range here. Instead of focusing on the petals, I focused on the middle of this rose, and it didn't completely blow the flower out. Well done there. Though it's difficult to test dynamic range beyond that point. As mentioned before, neither Z phone is saving RAW files for us to push exposure recovery. Those finished JPEGs retain a decent amount of detail though. Z Force photos range from around 4.5 meg to 11 meg. Moto Z photos range from 2.5 to 6.5 meg per shot. For video, both phones record around a 50 megabit per second bitrate, averaging under 400 megabytes per minute of UHD video. Now, checking out some software, Motorola hasn't always been known for providing the best camera apps, but what the Moto Z delivers is a revelation compared to my old Moto X2. The basics are well covered here once you feel out some quirks. Auto mode is fairly simple, and we have slow motion and panorama modes as separate options, and a fairly well-featured Pro mode with manual controls. For those paying attention, that Pro mode looks an awful lot like what Lumias have used for their camera apps, and the zooming action is a vertical slide instead of a pinch. But of course, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Though we are kind of bummed that in Pro mode, the longest exposure setting we get to play with is an anemic half-second long, so no fun streaking taillight shots for you. Now, the Z won't win any awards for macro shots. Minimum close focusing distance is a little less than 4 inches away from the lens, and in shots with busy backgrounds, the only way to get the phone to focus that close is to set it up manually. Though, even at 4 inches, we get some nicely softened backgrounds when you can put a little distance between your subject and other items. And for how similar these camera sensors are, the slightly larger Z Force camera sensor does seem to provide slightly smoother bokeh. Taking a look at the focusing, neither phone is a focusing champ. First of all, there's a bit of a tweak to how the phone locks on a subject. When just tapping to focus and refocus, often the target will miss where your finger tried to tap. What Moto intends for is a tap and slide to really hone in on the specific object you want. The issue with this is sliding requires a slightly longer interaction where my fat fingers block more of the screen, so it never feels quite as smooth or as precise as competing options from other flagship phones. Add to the fact that this focusing system is a little on the slower side, and our pre-release Motos both locked up on this test, refusing to focus where I tapped, and you end up with a perfect recipe for frustratingly long interactions for each photo. I quickly got in the habit of really planning ahead for every shot I wanted to take. And one area where these two did differ subtly was on white balance. On the whole, photos from the Moto Z were a little warmer than photos from the Z Force, and this was exacerbated in some of our HDR shots. Speaking of HDR, they're inconsistent, but these phones do try to rein in highlights while boosting shadow detail, like the sidewalk here. Night shots are even more inconsistent though. Sometimes we get great color boost, but in lower light situations, sometimes we get, well, nothing. The auto mode on these phones actually has a pretty solid night scanning solution. I don't believe HDR is a one-size-fits-all panacea for night photography, and I'd be more inclined to suggest people use the more consistent night mode here. Of course, Moto also includes HDR for UHD video, and they're just okay. Again, it's just hard to predict what you'll end up with. Sometimes you get a great balance of light and color, and sometimes the highlights and lowlights are just all smeared together in a dull mess of moving footage. This isn't a setting I'd rely on unless you can take a couple test videos to see what you'll end up with. And how about those panorama photos? In a word, awful. Motorola limits you to about half the range of what other phones will allow you to scan through, and when you do try to line up a good shot, there are often numerous stitching areas, like on this pole. How did the camera mess up a pole? This is very disappointing. But what isn't disappointing is including a decent flash for the front-facing camera. It's an otherwise normal flagship 5-megapixel selfie camera, but that little spotlight can really help in darker situations. Now, moving to nighttime photos, on the whole, the Z Force outperforms the regular Z. Our hypothesis, since the pixel size is the same, then the slightly larger image sensor on the Force might be helping it soak up a touch more light. Also, the higher resolution means that images look sharper and the noise is a little finer when comparing similar crops in similar scenes. We also see some slight lens distortions on the Z when looking at the street lamp above our creepy tunnel. The lens on our Force review unit is just a little bit cleaner in that regard. Where the Z was warmer with white balance in daylight, under artificial light, it's working a lot harder at finding the white of this gate and ignoring the yellow security lamp which lights this scene. And our walkway also shows when shooting auto, the night mode won't exaggerate color as much as HDR, but that also reins in noise. And moving to video, image processing on the Force was consistently better than on the Z. Looking at similar scenes, often the Z would feel duller or just not as crisp. Of course, every now and then we'd see a mess of over-sharpening on the Z Force, but overall we preferred the Force video. Looking at video, we can take a closer look at image stabilization, and we're happy to see that while both phones have hardware optical image stabilization, you are able to continue using software stabilization even when shooting UHD video. Now, results here aren't as smooth as what we might see on an iPhone 6s Plus, but this is one of the only Androids which will allow us to do this, so kudos for being one of the first, Motorola. But checking out the zoom range, zooming performance on both phones is kind of a hot mess. The higher resolution Force camera fares slightly better, but while Moto is advertising an 8x zoom on this phone, you probably won't want to use the full crop very often. But audio capture here is very good. Even-handed noise and wind filtering helps improve the sound of your subject. But constant sounds aren't reduced to that terrible warbling sound we've heard too often from competitors. And checking out exposure transitions moving from dark to bright and back, the image stabilization system did not like this lateral pan. Really big, chunky jumps in trying to anticipate my hand movements. Deactivating it helped smooth out the scene, but this is a pretty twitchy exposure system. Rapid and jarring transitions are a bit distracting, especially when the camera overshoots and you get a handful of really blue frames in an otherwise warm scene. We're hoping this is tied to the low light exposure issues and is fixed in a future software update. Lastly, looking at some slow motion video, it's a reasonable 720p at 120 frames per second. At this resolution, we wish we were saving a slightly higher quality image, or that we had options for 1080p or 240 frames per second, but it's fun to play with and adjust on the phone. So let's wrap this up. Where does this leave us with the camera on these new Motorolas? Well, hello Moto. What a nice little camera system you've grown into, especially on the Z Force. In owning the fact that we teased this as a versus in the title of the video, we'd be inclined to declare the Force the winner, not just for more resolution, but focusing performance was a little better, and we see improvements to white balance, low light performance, and overall video quality. To be clear, these cameras have some bugs, which need to be sorted out, but they are far more fun to use than on Motos of years past. The Z cameras do a perfectly serviceable job of covering the basics, and with a little coaxing, can deliver some really photographic images. But considering the competition and the launch prices for these phones, we just can't position them in the top tier of smartphone cameras. A little software tweaking would go a long way, however, so we hope to revisit these after they've had a little more time to marinate. As always, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe to this channel for our full Moto Z and Z Force coverage, and hit that thumbs up button for a little extra positive reinforcement. For Pocketnow, I'm Juan Carlos Bagnell, some gadget guy on Twitter and Instagram, and I will catch you all on the next review.